Welcome to Say the Question. I'm Joe, that's Sam, and today we're asking what biohacking really is when sleep, movement, food, and stress management get sold like elite science instead of basic common sense.
Yeah, because that's the awkward part. A quantified self-archive can put sleep monitoring right next to genetics-based exercise profiling and self-quantification devices, which makes the whole thing feel part diary, part gadget store, part status symbol.
Right, and that's exactly the question worth testing. So let's start with the idea that biohacking may be turning ordinary habits into premium optimization. Sam, start us off.
Here's the annoying little question at the center of all this. How much of biohacking is actually experimentation, and how much is just sleep, movement, food, and stress management with a fancier label? Because a lot of it sounds like ordinary health advice that got repackaged for people who want to feel like they found the upgrade version. Not necessarily wrong, just heavily dressed up.
That's the right place to start. I wouldn't call all of it fake, because some people really are testing what works for them. But the packaging question matters a lot. The same basic habits can be sincere, or they can be turned into a status product that makes normal discipline sound like proprietary knowledge. Once that happens, the sale gets blurry fast.
Exactly. If the big breakthrough is still sleep enough, move your body, eat better, manage stress, then what are we doing with all the extra ceremony? Why does it need an expensive label, a founder story, and language that makes people nod like they've just been briefed on classified medicine? That's the part that smells off to me. It's not the habit, it's the halo around the habit.
And that halo can be doing a lot of work. Sometimes it's not even that the advice is new. It's that the packaging turns something basic into something that feels exclusive, measurable, and upgraded. That can help people pay attention, sure, but it also lets you charge for the aura around the idea. So the real issue is not, are sleep and exercise valid? Of course they are. It's whether the marketing is selling insight or just selling a more flattering way to follow the same old rules.
Joe, am I overstating that if I say a lot of biohacking is basically discipline with a better haircut? Because part of me thinks that's too cynical, and part of me thinks that's exactly the point. There are probably real experiments happening somewhere in the mess, but the loud public version seems built to make normal self-care look like a private club.
That's the clean version of the suspicion. I'd tighten it a little. Some people are genuinely experimenting, some are mostly performing, and a lot are doing both at once without admitting it. That's why it gets slippery. The moment you wrap ordinary advice in a harder-to-enter identity, people start confusing access with quality. A sleep routine becomes evidence of elite thinking instead of just a sleep routine.
And that's the thing listeners should keep in mind. We're not mocking health habits. Nobody here is saying sleep is fake or walking is a scam. The question is whether biohacking is often just the same boring stuff, but sold as if it came out of a private lab for the unusually committed. That's a very different claim from take care of yourself. One is useful. The other is branding with a pulse.
Right, and that distinction matters because it tells you what kind of skepticism is fair. If someone says, "This helped me track my habits and stay consistent," that's one thing. If they imply, "This is the hidden key that only serious people understand," that's where the sales pitch starts to matter more than the health advice. The basic question is whether the product is helping you do ordinary things better, or whether it's just making ordinary things feel premium.
Yeah, and once you notice that, the whole thing gets easier to read. A lot of wellness culture isn't selling miracles. It's selling identity. I'm optimized. I'm informed. I'm not one of the people still trying to figure this out. That doesn't make every claim fraudulent. It just means the vibe is part of the product. And when the vibe is doing half the work, you should probably ask what's left after the vibe wears off.
That's probably the most honest opening place to land. Not biohacking is bullshit, and not biohacking is revolutionary. But how much of this is real experimentation, and how much is expensive rearranging of normal advice for people who want to buy the feeling of being ahead? That's the question worth testing. Because if the answer is mostly branding, then the habits may still be good. The pitch is just doing a lot more than the evidence can carry.
And that leaves the door open for the fair version of the argument. Maybe some of it is genuinely useful experimentation, and maybe some of it is just a nicer costume for basic self-discipline. The trick is not treating those as the same thing. Once you separate the two, the whole scene gets a lot less mystical and a lot more market-driven. Okay, so the suspicious part is not, oh no, people care about health. It is that the whole thing gets packaged like the fancy version of being a functional adult. Sleep, movement, food, stress management, normal stuff starts getting described like it is rare knowledge. And then the person saying it talks like they are handing you the code to the machine.
That is the cleanest place to start. The habits themselves are not weird. What makes people side-eye it is the presentation. These ordinary things get framed as if they are advanced, proprietary, or only visible to the people who know the right circles.
And that presentation does a lot of work, because once you wrap normal self-care in the right language, it stops sounding like advice and starts sounding like status. Now you are not just being told to sleep more, you are being told to join a tribe, buy the right products, and say it back in the approved voice, which is a very annoying way to be told to go to bed earlier.
And that is the hook.
Exactly. Joe, am I overstating it if I say a lot of the annoyance is really about the branding rather than the behavior? Because I think people hear the same basic advice and immediately get mad at the whole scene, not just the specific tip.
No, I think that is fair. The annoyance usually comes from a mismatch. The advice is familiar, but the packaging keeps acting like it is special access. And that can feel manipulative, even if nobody is literally lying. It is the move of saying, this is the same basic thing you could have done all along, but now it arrives with a story that makes it sound rarer than it is.
Right, and that story matters because it changes how people hear the whole message. If the messenger looks expensive enough, disciplined enough, or just weird enough to seem ahead of everyone else, the audience starts assuming the advice itself must be expensive too. So even when the actual thing being sold is sleep more, walk around, or stop acting like your nervous system is on fire all the time, the pitch makes it feel like you need a membership just to be normal.
That is the useful distinction, though. Some of this is just old advice in a sharper outfit, and some of it is the scene around the advice. Once a topic becomes personality-driven, the personality starts doing a lot of the persuading. People are not only buying the habit, they are buying the feeling that the habit belongs to a more controlled, more elite life.
So what part of the irritation is fair, and what part is just people being annoyed by anyone who sounds too polished? Because I think there is a line there. It is one thing to say, this helps me stay consistent. It is another thing to act like your morning routine is a moral achievement and everyone else is just not trying hard enough.
That is exactly the line. Fair suspicion starts when the pitch quietly smuggles in status. It stops being just health advice and starts becoming an identity test. Do you know the jargon? Do you buy the gear? Do you follow the right people? Do you talk about your body like you belong to the club? That is where people get prickly, because they can feel the judgment even when nobody says it out loud.
And that is why the whole thing lands so hard. People are not mad that someone values sleep or movement or food or stress management. They are mad that basic human maintenance keeps getting dressed up as rare expertise and then sold back like it is some kind of unlocked level. It is hard not to roll your eyes when normal life gets treated like a premium subscription.
That is the fairer version of the complaint. The real issue is not that the habits are fake, it is that the packaging can blur three different things: useful advice, status signaling, and marketing. Once those get tangled together, people cannot tell whether they are being helped, sold to, or quietly judged for not already having their life together. And that is the discomfort we should keep before we even get to the boring definition of what biohacking actually means.
Okay, but before we keep side-eyeing the whole biohacking scene, we should pin down what it even means. Because right now it feels like the kind of word that can mean I go to bed on time or I spent 12 grand trying to become a different species.
That's the right place to start. At the boring level, biohacking just means trying to change your body on purpose, usually by tracking something, adjusting something, and seeing what happens. Sometimes that's very normal stuff, like sleep, movement, food, and stress management. Sometimes it gets more gadget heavy or supplement heavy, and that's where the word starts carrying more attitude than information.
So if I put on a sleep tracker and decide coffee after 2 p.m. is a bad idea, am I biohacking or am I just an adult with a calendar and a vague sense of shame?
Probably both, depending on who's saying it. That's the annoying part. The basic idea is self-experimentation, but the label does a lot of costume work. The same behavior can be practical in one setting and performative in another. If your tracker helps you notice a pattern, that's useful. If you say it like you discovered the Rosetta Stone of the human body, that's a different business.
That's the thing I keep tripping over. The word makes ordinary habits sound like elite science. Like sleeping 8 hours is now a premium service with a founder story. A lot of this is just people taking common sense and giving it a shinier hat. If the behavior is basically the same, the only thing that changed is the branding around it.
Yeah, and that shinier hat is part of the product. That's not always fake, but it is marketing. If you call something biohacking, you raise the status of the behavior without necessarily changing the behavior itself. You can move the same basic habits into a more expensive frame, and suddenly it sounds advanced, disciplined, or exclusive. That doesn't prove the advice is bad. It just means the wrapper is doing work.
So the suspicious version is not that the habits are useless. It's that the packaging is doing the heavy lifting. Nobody wants to buy drink water and go for a walk when they can buy optimized resilience protocol. And once you put the fancy label on it, people start acting like they uncovered a secret instead of just naming a habit they already should have been doing.
That's a pretty fair suspicion. And to be precise, the packaging can do two things at once. It can help people take the habit seriously, and it can also make the habit look more novel than it is. Those are not the same claim. One is a communication trick, the other is a business trick. And sometimes they're sitting in the same sentence. The hard part is separating motivation from hype.
Okay, so when does useful self-tracking stop being useful and start becoming identity theater? Because there has to be a line somewhere. If there isn't, then the word is basically just a vibe with a spreadsheet.
I'd draw it at the point where the method stops being the main thing. If the tracking helps you make better decisions, that's a tool. If the real value is signaling that you are the kind of person who optimizes, then the label has become the product. And to be fair, that can still be profitable without being a total scam. It just means you're selling a different promise than the plain English version.
So the boring definition is basically measured self-experimentation, but the social version is a status machine. Same behavior, different vibe, different price tag. That also explains why people get annoyed so fast, because they're not always reacting to the behavior itself. Sometimes they're reacting to the way the behavior gets dressed up like it deserves applause.
That's the useful distinction. If someone is quietly tracking sleep and adjusting their routine, nobody needs to make a federal case out of it. If the whole point is to turn ordinary self-care into a premium identity, then the label is doing more than describing the practice. It's selling aspiration. And once you see that, the next question is sharper. Are people buying a better method, or are they buying the feeling that the method makes them special?
Okay, the lazy reaction is pretty simple. Biohacking is just expensive self-help with a cooler name. You hear optimization and you picture somebody charging money to tell adults to sleep more, move more, and stop eating like idiots.
That is the satisfying answer, though. It lets you roll your eyes, feel like you've solved the whole thing, and move on without asking whether any of it actually does anything. That little hit of certainty is part of why the bad answer sticks.
And the branding does invite that reaction. If you take normal stuff like sleep, movement, food, and stress management, then wrap it in elite person language, it starts sounding like common sense with a premium tag on it.
Sure, the packaging can be ridiculous. But packaging is not the same thing as the underlying behavior being fake. And that's where the lazy answer falls apart. A dumb label can sit on top of a useful habit without poisoning the habit itself.
So my dumb version is it's all gimmick and the only thing being hacked is your wallet. And
Yeah, that's
honestly,
the satisfying version, but it's too neat.
wait, are you saying the habits are the real part and the hype is just the costume? Because that feels like a nicer version than the one everybody wants to yell at. And I want to know if you're actually defending the whole thing or just the boring core of it.
Mostly the boring core. A person can call it biohacking and still just be doing things that actually help. Sleeping more consistently, moving more, eating less badly, paying attention to stress, or changing one habit on purpose instead of 10 habits at once because they saw a thread online. The label can be pretentious without the behavior being useless.
That's the annoying part, because the stupid label can still point at a real problem. If somebody buys a fancy app just to stop scrolling until 2 in the morning, the app is overhyped, but the actual move is still pretty normal and useful.
Exactly. Or somebody starts calling a regular walk after dinner a protocol, and suddenly it sounds like they've joined a secret society of hydrology, when really, they just needed a reason to get off the couch. The ritual can be a little silly and still be helpful.
So the insult isn't that the advice is always wrong. It's that the delivery is trying way too hard to make ordinary discipline feel like insider knowledge.
That's the clean version. The reason the knee-jerk dismissal still fails is that it mixes together three different things: useful habits, genuine experimentation, and marketing theater. If you call all three the same thing, you stop noticing the difference between a real change and a sales pitch.
Right, because the first answer makes you feel clever. It lets you say, got it, all snake oil. And then you don't have to deal with the annoying fact that some boring habits are still boring because they work. That part is less fun. which is probably why people skip it.
Exactly. So the bad first answer is too smug, and the better answer is less dramatic. Some of this is rebranded basics, some of it is sincere tinkering, and some of it is status theater. The next step is figuring out where that line actually sits, because that's the part that matters.
Okay, so the fair split is probably not biohacking is fake versus biohacking is the future. It's more like some people are genuinely trying to figure out what works, and some people are buying a vibe that happens to come with a wellness subscription.
That's the cleaner version. The suspicious version isn't that everyone involved is a fraud. It's that the packaging often outruns the actual idea. So ordinary habits start getting treated like they arrived from a lab instead of a refrigerator and a calendar.
And from the outside, that packaging does a lot of heavy lifting. If you can make sleep, food, movement, and stress management sound like a frontier discipline, you can sell the feeling of being one of the people who gets it.
Sure, but the other fair reading is that a lot of people only start paying attention when ordinary advice gets personal enough to stick. If a generic warning doesn't change your behavior, a more tailored experiment sometimes does. The label can be doing real work there.
That makes sense. And the weird part is that the more ordinary the behavior is, the more people seem to want an elevated story around it. Nobody gets excited by, I went to bed earlier, but a branded method can make the same advice feel like revelation.
That's part of the appeal. It gives people a structure and a tribe, and those are not fake needs. If the structure helps you actually do the boring thing, I don't think it's dishonest by default.
I buy that part. But Joe, am I overstating it when I say the scene still rewards people for sounding expensive? Because once something sounds premium, people start treating it like wisdom before they even ask whether it works.
No, that's fair. There's a real difference between useful experimentation and turning basic self-care into a luxury identity. And the second one can absolutely crowd out the first. The fancier language can help people pay attention, but it can also separate insiders from everyone else.
Right, because once the status layer shows up, people stop asking only, did this help? They also start asking, does this make me sound like somebody worth listening to? And that is where the whole thing gets slippery.
That's the danger, yes. A method can become a signal, and then the signal starts driving the method. At that point, you're no longer just optimizing behavior. You're curating a public identity around optimization.
So where do you draw the honest line? At what point does helpful framing become, we're selling you a personality instead of a practice?
I think it starts when the product is more about belonging than behavior. If the point is to help you sleep better, move more, or manage stress more cleanly, great. If the point is to make the advice feel exclusive, then exclusivity is doing half the sales job.
That's the part that bugs me. A lot of these ideas are ordinary good sense with a premium accent. The accent isn't always the problem, but it's often the thing charging extra.
Sometimes, sure. But sometimes people pay because they've already failed with the free version 10 times and want any structure that feels serious. That motive doesn't make them shallow. It makes them tired.
Fair. I don't want to mock the person who finally found a routine that works. I want to mock the person who turns decent sleep hygiene into a status ladder and then acts like the ladder itself is the achievement.
That's the better target. The person quietly improving their life is one thing. The person selling a cleaner life as proof they've unlocked a better class of human is another. Those are not the same vibe, even if they use the same vocabulary.
Do you think people start with the branding and then rationalize the usefulness later, or is that too cynical?
Sometimes they do, yeah, but I wouldn't make that the whole story. A lot of people start with a real problem, then get handed a prettier explanation that feels more meaningful than, I needed to go to bed earlier and stop making excuses.
So the scene can be both sincere and inflated. Which motive is doing more of the work depends on the person, the product, and how much the exclusivity is part of the sale.
Exactly. And that question is the one worth carrying forward. Because once we separate the useful practice from the premium packaging, we can actually look at who benefits and how much of the value is real.
Okay, so before we keep arguing from vibes, let's look at where this whole thing actually came from. Because biohacking sounds like either a lab accident or a guy selling magnesium.
The clean origin story is more boring than that. Quantified Self started in 2007 as a community of users and makers of self-tracking tools. And the basic idea was self-knowledge through numbers. A lot of it was people asking personal questions, trying a thing, and seeing what happened.
So, notebooks and curiosity before the whole elite wellness costume.
Exactly. And the interesting part is that they now use language like personal science with self-tracking, self-experiment, N of one methods, and single subject research, all floating around the same practice. That is real experimentation. But it also makes a pretty ordinary thing sound like you need a white coat and a membership fee.
Joe, where would you draw the line? If I write down what happens when I sleep more or cut coffee, that feels useful. If somebody turns it into a whole identity, that's where my eyes start rolling. Are those actually different things, or is it just the same habit with a nicer suit on?
They're different in the sense that the first one is a tool and the second one is a story. Quantified Self also points out that lab notebooks have been core scientific tools for centuries, and it recommends simple note-taking as part of self-tracking. So one version of biohacking is basically old scientific habits with a modern label. The fancy wrapper is doing a lot of work.
And then the category starts swallowing everything. Their own project archives include sleep monitoring, athletic performance, genetics-based exercise profiling, and self-quantification devices. That is pretty widespread from I tracked my bedtime to here's a machine, a spreadsheet, and maybe a tiny identity crisis.
That spread is the point. The same space can hold something very plain, like noticing whether you feel better when you sleep more, and something much more technical, like device-heavy or genetics-flavored optimization. But the archive doesn't prove the fancy stuff works better. It mostly shows how broad the category got once people started treating everyday self-observation as a practice instead of a private habit.
So this is where the marketing gets sneaky. Ordinary self-tracking is, I paid attention and learned something. Premium biohacking is, I paid attention, but now I need the branded ecosystem, the dashboard, and the idea that my breakfast has been scientifically upgraded.
Yeah, and that distinction matters because the behavior itself can be legitimate while the packaging is inflated. Measurement culture can make common sense feel more advanced than it is. You sleep, you move, you eat, you notice patterns. That's good. But once the pitch becomes normal health is incomplete unless you buy into this optimized framework, then you should ask who that story is for.
And who gets to feel smart by selling it? Because that is the part that keeps bothering me. If the underlying advice is mostly boring and solid, why does it keep arriving dressed like a revelation?
Exactly. That is the next question. Whether the premium language is mainly about better experimentation, or whether it's also about status, branding, and selling certainty to people who like the feeling of being ahead of the crowd.
Okay, but once you strip away the buzzwords, the next question is, who actually makes money when ordinary stuff gets sold like elite optimization?
That is the useful question. Because a lot of this isn't just one cynical guy in a hoodie trying to sell you a miracle. It's a whole setup where money, attention, and status all point in the same direction.
Right, and the first obvious winner is the seller. If you can make sleep, movement, food, and stress sound like a premium system instead of basic adult behavior, now you can charge for the interface, the device, the subscription, the course, the membership, the retreat, whatever.
And that's where the structure matters. In the self-tracking world, there are meetups, participant-led projects, devices, software platforms, and service providers all living in the same neighborhood. So there's a built-in market around people who want to measure themselves and improve something.
So even before anyone gets weird about it, the ecosystem is already set up to sell the tools of self-improvement. The business model is basically, here's your normal habit, now here's the expensive version with better branding.
That's pretty close, though I'd say the pitch is usually more flattering than that. It's not buy a normal habit, it's unlock the version of yourself that other people don't have access to yet.
Which is just a dressed up way of saying you can buy an advantage, or at least the feeling of one.
Exactly. And that feeling matters because the audience isn't just buying a product. They're buying the possibility of being ahead, being informed, being the person with the data.
So status is part of the sale, not a side effect.
Yeah, and in that space, the language of personal science gives people a way to make ordinary self-discipline sound more serious. That doesn't mean the habits are fake. It means the packaging adds prestige.
That's the part that bugs me. Plenty of people really do want to learn from their own data, and quantified self even frames it as every person's right and ability to learn from that data. Fine. But once you put the right story around it, suddenly a spreadsheet becomes a lifestyle brand.
Right, and I think that's the split we have to keep clean. There is an earnest research and public health side to some of this, and there is also a commercial side that benefits when the same behavior feels exclusive, technical, and a little bit superior.
So you're saying the greed version is too simple.
Too simple, yes. Some founders and influencers probably genuinely believe the routines help them. But belief and incentive can live in the same house. Once people get attention for sounding ahead of the curve, it's very hard to tell where conviction ends and business starts.
And the audience helps keep it alive because people want an edge. Nobody wants to hear sleep more, walk more, eat like a sane person, and calm down. They want the version where it sounds like they found the secret door.
That desire is real, though. Wanting an edge is not the same thing as being stupid. The problem is that once you have people chasing advantage, every new layer of terminology makes the ordinary feel like insider knowledge.
And that desire isn't just about health. A lot of people are buying the chance to look like they got there first, like they figured out the future before the rest of us did. That's a status purchase as much as a wellness purchase.
That's the sharper version. And it's not always conscious. People want the shortcut, sure, but they also want the social signal that says, I'm not doing generic self-help. I'm doing the advanced version.
And then exclusivity starts doing half the selling for you. If only the serious people are supposed to understand it, that alone makes it feel more valuable.
Which is why the incentives are so sticky. Sellers get revenue, promoters get credibility, Buyers get status or hope, and everyone can tell themselves they're just being disciplined. The whole thing keeps moving because each person gets a different payoff from the same polished story.
So the durable answer is not it's all fake. It's that the packaging works because it serves the people selling it and the people who want to be seen buying it.
Yeah. And the uncomfortable part is that the public story is usually the cleanest one, not the truest one. The next question is how different those two stories really are.
Okay, so the polite answer is basically people are finally taking sleep and stress seriously. The real answer is messier. Some of that is sincere, and some of it is absolutely about identity. That's the part people don't say out loud because it sounds shallow, but shallow is often where the money is.
That's the useful split. The bad move is acting like there's one clean motive, and everybody either has pure health goals or pure vanity. Most of the time it's mixed. And the mix matters because packaging can change what feels legitimate.
And biohacking gives people a very convenient story to tell themselves. Nobody wants to say, I bought the expensive tracker so I could feel special. They say, I'm optimizing, which, fine, maybe they are, but optimizing can hide a lot of ego in a nicer jacket.
It can, but it can also hide real effort. Someone can genuinely care about sleep, movement, food, whatever the habit is, and still like that the whole routine makes them look disciplined, serious, and maybe a little higher status than the person winging it.
Right, and that higher status part is doing more work than people admit. If a practice sounds elite, suddenly the ordinary version looks embarrassing, like basic hygiene with a branding problem. The health claim is real, but the social proof is often what gets people to pay attention in the first place.
And that means the polite version is too clean. It says, this is just people making a smart choice. When the more accurate version is, people are making a smart choice, and the choice also signals taste, discipline, money, and membership in a tribe that feels meaningful.
Which is exactly the annoying part.
Yeah, but that still doesn't make it all fake. It means the packaging is doing persuasion work, the way good branding does. If the method also helps a little, then the status layer and the health layer are riding together, not pretending the other one doesn't exist.
So the fair complaint isn't every biohacker is lying. It's more like when people describe themselves as doing serious self-experimentation, a lot of the appeal is that it sounds like serious self-experimentation, even when the actual behavior is pretty normal. Joe, am I overstating that?
That's close. The cleaner criticism is that the language can make ordinary habits sound like frontier science, and that can overstate the novelty. But you still shouldn't assume the person has no real health motive just because the presentation is sleek or expensive.
No, and that's where the whole thing gets slippery. The uncomfortable truth is that they might be getting a little healthier, feeling more in control, and enjoying the status at the same time. People hate that answer because it doesn't let them be pure, but it's probably closer to how humans work.
Exactly. And if you want the stronger version of the criticism, it's not that the habits are useless. It's that the public story often hides how much of the appeal comes from being able to say, I take my body seriously, in a way that sounds cleaner than saying, I like what this says about me.
That is the part people keep stepping around. Because once you admit status is in the mix, everyone acts like you've accused them of fraud, and that's not the same thing. There's a big difference between this helps and also flatters me, and this is all a grift.
Right. And the honest answer is usually mixed motives and uneven results, not a scam and not sainthood. The next question is where the packaging stops being harmless and starts becoming the main event.
Okay, so the mistake people make is thinking this whole world is either fake rich people wellness or actual science in a lab coat. Both of those are too tidy, which usually means they're wrong in different directions.
That's the cleaner version. A lot of it is just self-tracking and habit change with a fancier outfit. And some of it really is a person testing what helps them.
Right, and that middle answer is annoying because it doesn't give you a clean dunk. If somebody sleeps better because they track sleep, that's real. It is also not the same thing as discovering a new law of human biology.
That's the key distinction. Measurement can be useful without being revolutionary. The basic idea in the quantified self world is self-knowledge through numbers, which is a pretty modest goal if you say it plainly, and a very grand one if you dress it up.
And that's where the marketing starts reaching for your wallet. The dumb version is, it's all nonsense. The equally dumb opposite is, my vibration cold plunge ledger is the future of medicine.
That's fair. And the annoying truth is that both versions miss how the market actually works. A lot of these habits are real habits: sleep, movement, food, stress management. But the packaging turns them into elite discovery instead of basic maintenance.
Exactly. Walking and sleeping aren't new. A notebook isn't new. But put it behind a subscription, a podcast host, and a sleek dashboard, and suddenly it's being sold like forbidden knowledge.
Or like you need a permission slip to notice your own life. That's the part that matters to me. The practice may be boring and useful, while the branding is trying very hard to sell the feeling that you're ahead of ordinary people.
And to be fair, old doesn't mean useless. If keeping a record helps you notice you feel awful after certain foods, that's not fake just because your grandma could have told you to pay attention. The tool can be ordinary and still do a job.
No, and that's where people overcorrect. They hear hype and decide the whole category is a scam. But a thing can be overhyped in presentation and still genuinely helpful in practice. You don't have to treat every useful habit like a miracle to admit it works.
So what counts as real experimentation, and what's just expensive journaling with better lighting? Because that line matters more than the product page wants you to think.
Usually it's real when the person is clear about what they observed, what changed, and what they still don't know. If it's, "This helped me," that's one thing. If it's, "I have unlocked the code of health because I wore a ring," that's marketing pretending to be insight.
That's the line people keep stepping over. A useful routine becomes a philosophy. Then the philosophy becomes a business. And then suddenly nobody can tell whether the original thing was small and practical or secretly earth-shattering.
And the funny part is, the small practical version is usually the better one. A simple notebook, a sleep log, a food record, a week of paying attention to stress. That can absolutely help. It just doesn't need a moonshot voiceover attached to it.
That's the useful middle. Some of this is practical self-knowledge, some of it is rebranded common sense, and some of it is pure costume. The hard part is telling which is which before the slogan gets loud and before everyone starts acting like ordinary habits are a luxury product.
Yeah, and that's why the next question is less, is it fake? And more, who is this actually for? And why does it need to feel elite?
Okay, but the uncomfortable part is this keeps acting like biohacking is something companies are doing to people from the outside. A lot of it survives because the audience wants to believe there's a cleaner, sharper version of ordinary self-care waiting behind a premium label.
That's the better question, honestly. Not just who is selling it, but who keeps rewarding the packaging with attention, money, and status? Because once people start acting like the packaging itself is the value, the market has very little reason to stop.
And the reward is not only this helped me. It's also, look at me. I'm disciplined. I'm ahead of the curve. I'm not just eating whatever sadness sandwich the rest of the office is eating.
That's part of the social payoff. Even when the basic behavior is boring, sleep, movement, food, stress management, the branding can make it feel like you've been admitted into some smarter, more serious group. The label gives the habit a little status it doesn't naturally have on its own.
Which is annoying, because I get it. The plain version sounds like homework. The upgraded version sounds like you're not just trying to be healthy, you're trying to be the kind of person who does health correctly.
Right, and that's why the plain advice loses so often. It's true, but it doesn't flatter anybody. Biohacking packaging gives people a reason to care, a reason to pay, and a reason to feel like they're buying into something more intentional than generic self-improvement.
Joe, am I overstating it if I say the story is half the product, not just the pills or the routines?
Not half every time.
But enough that pretending it's just neutral information is silly. Yeah, that's fair. People are buying the habit, but they're also buying the feeling that they've found the smarter, more serious version of the habit.
Exactly. And that feeling matters more than people like to admit. If a product lets you say, I'm on top of this, or I'm investing in myself, that's doing real work. It's not fake in the sense of being meaningless. It's just not only about the underlying health behavior.
That's the part I think people miss when they get defensive. Wanting the premium version does not automatically mean you're gullible. Sometimes you want permission. Sometimes you want structure. Sometimes you want the thing to feel serious enough that you'll actually do it instead of just vaguely agreeing with it for 6 months.
That's the honest version. Skepticism and desire can live in the same person. You can know a thing is mostly repackaged common sense and still want the repackaging because it comes with confidence, a clearer identity, and a little social cover when you talk about it to other people.
So the audience isn't just being manipulated, it's participating. Not in some evil mastermind way, just in the ordinary human way where we keep rewarding stuff that makes us look disciplined, ahead of the curve, or slightly more enlightened than we actually are.
That's the uncomfortable answer. People aren't only victims of the branding, they help keep it alive by preferring the version that flatters them. They want the benefit, sure, but they also want the prestige of having found the better version of the benefit.
And that's why the plain answer never wins cleanly. Sleep more, move more, eat better, manage stress is true, but it doesn't come dressed like a membership card.
Yeah, and once enough people reward the membership card version, the packaging stops looking like fluff and starts looking like the actual business model. That's the piece worth sitting with before we land this.
So after all that, I think the clean answer is this. Biohacking is real sometimes, but a lot of it is ordinary health advice wearing a black turtleneck and asking for more money. Sleep better, move more, eat less garbage, calm down a little. That part is not some forbidden secret. The weird part is when people act like basic habits turn into genius the second you give them a tracker and a name that sounds expensive.
That's pretty close. The useful version is usually some mix of trial and error, self-knowledge, and a willingness to admit that different people respond differently. The cultural version is where the language gets bigger than the behavior. At that point, you're not only buying a habit, you're buying the feeling that you found a smarter class of habit.
Joe, am I overstating it if I say the packaging is often the product? Because that feels like the sneaky part. The sleep advice might be fine, but the pitch is doing a lot of work to make people feel like they're buying access to a higher tier of life.
That's the sharper version, yes. Not always the whole product, but often a big part of it. People are paying for confidence, identity, and the sense that they are ahead of everybody else. So you have to separate the habit from the story around it. Those are different questions. And the second one is where a lot of a nonsense lives.
And the honest thing is that some of these habits do help. If somebody says, I sleep better when I do X, fine. That can be a real observation. But the second they turn that into a universal system or a personality or a way to look more serious than everyone else, now I start thinking, okay, this got marketed into the stratosphere.
Right, and that leap matters. A lot of the time, the claim is modest at first, and then the packaging does all the heavy lifting. The story becomes bigger than the result. That doesn't mean the result is fake. It means the explanation has started borrowing confidence it didn't earn.
So if I'm being fair, the actual question isn't, is biohacking fake? It's, when does a useful habit stop being a useful habit and start becoming a sales pitch? Because people are not dumb for wanting to feel better. They're just pretty easy to sell to once you frame normal self-control like a revelation.
Exactly. And that's where the line should be. If the claim is specific, this helped me, this is what I tried, this is what changed. That is ordinary experimentation. If the claim starts getting vague, grand, and status heavy, then you're mostly being sold a story. The story might be entertaining. It might even motivate somebody, but it's not the same thing as evidence.
That's the part I keep landing on. Strip away the expensive words, and a lot of this is sleep, movement, food, and stress management, which are good things, by the way. They just do not become more true because somebody says them in a more confident voice or wraps them in a lifestyle.
And that's the fair conclusion. Don't mock the experiment just because the branding is annoying. Some people really are testing what works for them, and that can be valuable. But don't let the branding carry more authority than the result. If the pitch only works when it sounds elite, then the pitch is doing too much.
So the useful filter is pretty simple. Would I still take this seriously if it were said plainly? If the answer is yes, maybe it's a decent idea. If the answer is no, and it only sounds impressive when it's dressed up, then it's probably just repackaged common sense with a markup. That saves a lot of money and a lot of fake wonder.
Yeah, that's the version I'd leave people with. Be open to honest tinkering, because sometimes people do find useful variations. Just don't confuse that with a new species of wisdom. If the claim survives plain English, it might be worth listening to. If it falls apart the second you remove the hype, then the hype was the whole point. So, that's the end of this one. We appreciate you listening to Say the Question. Follow Say the Question, and we'll be back with another episode tomorrow.